Hey, everybody. So I wanted to have a chat with you folks who are interested in the Syria conflict, which has been going on since 2011. But maybe more importantly, I also wanted to have a chat with folks who, beyond Syria, are just generally interested in how we can cut through disinformation and propaganda to ensure that when war crimes occur, that they are investigated, identified, and punished, or at the very least, that we can at least respect some decency for the victims of those crimes, for the victims of leaders and militaries who continue to kill them, who injure them, or who force them through their homes. On April 7th, 2018, Russia and the Assad regime forces in Syria were pursuing a 2-month offensive to overrun a city called Douma. Now, Douma was the last city holding out in an opposition area near the capital, Damascus, a region called East Ghouta. Every other place had fallen. But in Douma, there were still tens of thousands of residents who were not surrendering. On April the 7th, there was an intense conventional bombardment. Witnesses speak of the fact of complete mayhem as civilian sites across the city were bombed without any regard for life. In the midst of that conventional bombing, though, reports spread that there had been chemical attacks. It would turn out that rescuers would respond to 2 sites where it was suspected that chlorine had been used. We would later find out that in one of the 2 sites, this was a fog of war incident in which an attack on a building near a bakery turned out not to be with chlorine. It was with a conventional weapon which stirred up a lot of dust, and victims suffocated as if they were having symptoms of chlorine. In the second case, however, there was a canister which witnesses said was dropped by a helicopter of the Assad regime. That canister lodged in the roof of the building, and it apparently released chlorine gas. That gas descended, it funneled down the building, making it a far more toxic type of release than you normally get with chlorine. And it so happened that there were dozens of people that were coming up from the basement at the same time to try to get to safety. The gas enveloped those people, and witnesses say that 43 people were killed on that day in April 2018. The bodies were put together, they were photographed to document that this had occurred, this war crime had taken place, and then they were quickly buried so they couldn't be seized by the Russian regime forces that were possibly going to take control of the city. Indeed, did take control of the city, because on the day after that chlorine attack, on April the 8th, 2018, Douma surrendered. The last opposition area near Damascus fell. And the question became, could this chlorine attack, as well as the conventional attacks, be recognized and investigated? It took 2 weeks for inspectors from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to get into Douma. The Assad regime kept saying there were regime concerns. The Russians kept saying it wasn't safe to go in there. And so as Russian forces surrounded the suspected site of the chlorine attacks, those 2 buildings, the inspectors stayed outside. It was only in late April that they began to get into, and they tried to get whatever evidence remained so that they could carry out an investigation to find out if indeed this was a chemical attack. Well, they gathered enough information for 2 reports. There was an interim report in June of 2018, and then there was a final report in March of 2019. This year, by something called the Fact-Finding Commission. Now, the Fact-Finding Commission is not there to assign blame for this. They are only to ascertain if a chemical weapon had been used. And they said that there were reasonable grounds to believe that chlorine had been released, and that it was possible that that chlorine had been released from the canister that lodged in the roof of that building where 43 people were killed. They did not say it was definitive that it was that canister. Of course, it was not part of their mandate to blame the Assad regime for this. But instead, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons then refers this to something called the Investigations and Identifications Team who can assume responsibility. And indeed, it is possible that they may report in early 2020 on this incident, as well as on 6 others. Now, that is what happened. That's what we can ascertain from multiple witnesses, including witnesses who have spoken to us at EA Worldview, doctors, first responders, citizen journalists, activists that were in the area. But this story was an inconvenient story for the Assad regime. Now, this was far from the first chemical attack in Syria. The United Nations has found the Assad regime responsible since 2014 for 33 chlorine and sarin attacks. That doesn't even count the most deadly attack that took place, the sarin attacks near Damascus in August 2013 that killed at least 1,400 people, because the UN didn't have responsibility or the ability at that point to assign blame for an incident. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons did not have the authority to get in and investigate until after the Assad regime, in the aftermath of the East Ghouta incident, at the point of being basically not only criticized, but facing punitive action for what it had done, said, oh, okay, we'll hand over our chemical weapons, we'll hand over our chemical stocks, we'll let the inspectors in. Between 2015 and 2017, the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons could assign blame for an incident. They had something called the Joint Investigative Mechanism. But this was very inconvenient, remember, for the Assad regime. And it was very inconvenient for Russia, which had, in the autumn of 2015, to prop up the regime, had gone in with military intervention, but also a very heavy, what you might call information intervention, trying to justify the regime and to denigrate the opposition. So in 2017, when the Joint Investigative Mechanism, this part of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, reported on a sarin attack on Han Sheikhoun, that's a town in northwest Syria. They said, look, in this incident where about 90 people were killed, hundreds were injured, this was the responsibility of the Assad regime. This was a sarin canister that was dropped, that was inside a cylinder, dropped by a regime warplane. The Russians were so unsettled by this that they cast a veto in the UN Security Council to say, no more joint investigative mechanism. We don't want any further investigation that can assign blame. But remember, the Russians were overruled in 2018 when the OPCW's member states, despite the Russian objections and despite the Assad regime, said, no, we're still going to attribute blame if we think that we can establish someone's responsible for this incident. We'll do it through this new investigations and identification team. They said that in June 2018. And so immediately the Russians had a problem. What if the investigations and identification team eventually blamed Assad, and once more, you had a regime that was in the spotlight for deliberately using chemical weapons on civilians, no matter what the toll was. In March 2019, when the fact-finding mission said, look, chlorine has been used, it is likely, reasonable grounds that chlorine has been used, the Russians needed to act, and they needed to act quickly. And that brings us to the next part of our story, the disinformation and the propaganda. Within days of that report, the Russians were filing memorandum with the OPCW, which said, this is a politicized investigation. There's other facts which haven't been taken in. There's no way that chlorine could have killed all these people. This is, in effect, a manufactured report. The matter might have stopped there, except there was a catalyst, which those who wanted to support the Assad regime and the Russians could seize. And indeed, the Russians may have made sure this catalyst made it to the public eye, which is in May of 2019. There was an OPCW staff member. Now, he's not a chemical specialist. He was not part of the formal inspection team that went into Douma. He was the liaison in Damascus between the OPCW and the local bodies, to say, look, we're here, we have inspectors, let's make sure we can operate. This man was named Ian Henderson, and Ian Henderson, who, and we have this from good knowledge from speaking with folks, Ian Henderson, who really had wanted to be part of the fact-finding mission, indeed wanted to lead the inspection team, had finally said, look, let me be part of this. Let me go to Douma and let me help collect some samples. But Henderson went beyond his remit. When he got back to Damascus, he chose to consult some folks at some universities, and he said, look, we're going to run some engineering tests. We're going to see if this canister, which supposedly contained chlorine, if the cylinder that contained it had been dropped by a helicopter. And they ran simulations, which tried to say, oh, no, there's no way that the helicopter could have dropped this. The cylinder must have been placed there by someone who possibly drug it up the steps and took it all the way to the top of the building where it lodged. Now, there are problems with that engineering assessment, and I won't go into the technical questions that have been raised about it. What is significant here is that Ian Henderson's investigation was outside the remit of the fact-finding mission. The fact-finding mission was not trying to ascertain if the Assad regime had carried out the attack. That is not part of their mandate at this point. They just wanted to know if chlorine had been used. So when Henderson produced his memo just before, in March of this year, and said to the fact-finding mission, you have to include this. You have to say that we don't think this was airdropped. The fact-finding mission quite rightly said that this is not the place for that. You can submit that memo to the investigations and identification team when they consider attribution of responsibility. Well, Henderson or someone close to Henderson, or someone willing to exploit Henderson's report, wasn't satisfied with that. So within 6 weeks of the Russians making their complaints, Henderson's memo, which uses some of the same language that the Russians used, came out to say, this fact-finding mission report, you can't accept it, it's not valid. What's really interesting is how the Henderson memo came out, though. Ian Henderson didn't release it. The Russians, of course, didn't release it. That's a little bit too blatant. It was given by an unknown person, still unnamed, to a group of UK academics who fashioned themselves as the Working Group on Syria Propaganda and Media. They created themselves at the start of 2017. Now, this working group has no expert on Syria. None of them have been involved in Syria in the past. It does have one specialist who used to be at Sheffield University, who is now in retirement in Germany. But they have no real expertise in chemistry. They have no expertise in physics. They have no expertise in engineering. They have no expertise on the Syrian case. But without checking the Henderson memo, without doing any type of fundamental research behind it, they simply printed it. And they announced that this must be proof that, in fact, no one died from a chlorine attack in Douma on April 7, 2018, that the 43 victims who were found in that building were part of a staged massacre, that someone must have killed them elsewhere, someone being anti-Assad fighters, and put them in that building to blame the Assad regime for a chlorine attack that never happened. Now, even the Henderson memo doesn't go that far. It doesn't say in any respect it's a staged attack. It just says the cylinder wasn't airdropped. So the working group, in other words, was creating a fantasy. They were creating a conspiracy theory. But of course, it was a conspiracy theory that the Russians loved. TASS, RT, Sputnik, Russia Insider, the Duran, that whole system of Russian state outlets and of social media activists jumped on all of this and completely not only said that this attack didn't happen, said that the OPCW was flawed, that these inspectors were in effect illegitimate because they were politicized. So not only an attempt to deny the war crime, but to deny any future inspection of war crimes, which of course is the overall Russian objective. That is the first phase of what happened in this disinformation campaign. Now, the Henderson memo, there was a lot of toing and froing about it, and it kind of faded. The investigations and identification team proceeded with their work. And then this autumn, the second phase of the disinformation campaign came out from a second OPCW staffer who was dissatisfied. Now, this man is known by the pseudonym of Alex. We are almost certain who the real Alex is, but I'm not going to say that here. Let it be known, however, that because we know who Alex probably is, that gives some weight to the story that I'm about to tell you. Alex was part of the initial inspection team, the fact-finding mission that produced the interim report in June 2018. He collected samples. He was not the investigators that went in and then assembled all the evidence. He was not an analyst of the evidence per se, but he had that responsibility in basically making sure that all the samples were there to be checked out. He was also involved in helping draft the report of June 2018, but he got into a disagreement with the other members of the fact-finding commission. The main point of contention was that Alex said, no, the levels of chlorine, or what are called chlorinated organic compounds in this building where the 43 people died, you're wrong. The levels of chlorine weren't higher than what you could normally find. Now, he presented his case. The other members of the fact-finding mission considered it. But they refused to say in the interim report that there was no possibility that chlorine was used. Alex was upset about this. Alex was not part of subsequent investigations that led to the final report in March of 2019. He did other duties for the OPCW. Those investigators continued to check out what they had found about the canister, about the levels of chlorine. They took more witness statements. They took more statements from medical professionals. They looked at the toxicology again. And in their report in March 2019, they did make some, as it were, well, changes, in effect acknowledging what Alex had said. They no longer said that it was probable that the canister had actually been the source of the chlorine, that it was no longer likely, I should say, but they said it was possible. They opened that out for further investigation. They also took note of Alex's objections regarding how they had calculated the chlorinated organic compounds, and they put that in the final report. But Alex, who remember was no longer part of the team, was still very, very unhappy. And Alex, well, eventually decided this autumn that he would express his unhappiness. Alex went, or was discovered by, or a broker put the two together, the Courage Foundation. The Courage Foundation is very interesting. Not really a foundation. It's actually a PR outlet that was established as, well, basically on behalf of WikiLeaks. They may even be part of WikiLeaks and its founder, Julian Assange. But because WikiLeaks and Assange have been very much of the opinion that chemical weapons attacks have not occurred in Syria, that it's all part of a Western, as it were, imperialist plot, they were quite happy to host Alex or even invite him. And he gave a presentation this autumn, still unclear exactly how he presented himself. Doesn't appear that he actually appeared in person, or might not have appeared in person because, his real name didn't emerge after the presentation. But he told a group of people who were assembled together. There were some journalists who were there. There were some activists who were there. The Director General, former Director General of OPCW, Jose Bustani, was invited to be there but couldn't attend because of ill health. And Alex told his story. He said, I've been mistreated. They got the toxicology wrong. They got the chlorinated organic compounds wrong. There was a political campaign to quash the report that I wrote. And a so-called panel, in other words, some of those who were there, put out a statement which endorsed what Alex had said. Now, there are some, known names on there. Richard Falk, who used to work for the United Nations. His name is there. Jose Bustani, even though he didn't hear what Alex said, he put his name on it. And so now the Russians and the Assad regime and the activists could all run with this again. This is part of basically a Western conspiracy to blame the Assad regime. Look, we have a second person who now, in light of what is happening with the Trump impeachment trial, they wanted to call a whistleblower to give him legitimacy. Alex is not a whistleblower. Alex is a disgruntled employee. But you got the narrative. Now, this is a serious story that needs to be checked out, because if Alex is right, there was political pressure put on for the inspections to blame the Assad regime. It was manipulated. Jonathan Steele, who used to be at The Guardian, who's now freelance, put this story into a pretty well-known alternative media outlet named Counterpunch, where he had simply repeated what Alex had said, just implicated under it. Well, my questions were this. How did anyone verify Alex's story? In other words, that he was an employee of the OPCW, that Alex was a member of the fact-finding mission. How did anyone verify the claims that he made about how the interim report was constructed and about the chemistry in it? And did anyone get any other corroborating sources for what Alex had said? And the reply I got was very interesting, because one of the journalists who was at the presentation finally came back to me. He said, well, Alex showed us an email, or showed me an email, which established his identity, right? Which indicated, in other words, it must be an email which was an internal OPCW email, right? Okay, that's fine, I'll buy that. And that's a good journalist thing. You've established who Alex is, especially if you can check who he sent the email to. But then the journalist said something very interesting. He says, it's not my job to verify the claims he made. It's the claims of the OPCW. Whoa, wait a minute. Wait a minute. No, it's your job as a journalist. It was the panel's job, before endorsing what Alex had said, to verify the claims. That's just a basic principle one-on-one when you're dealing with information and propaganda. You don't just put out what someone says without checking it. And indeed, the journalist said something even more interesting to a following question. I said, where are the documents that Alex produced to support his story? Where are the emails beyond the one that you saw? Where are the documents about the chemistry, about the way the report was drafted? Where is the original report that Alex says he wrote? And the journalist said, oh, Alex refused to produce them. He said he wouldn't produce. In other words, you're the main source trashing the OPCW. The so-called whistleblower wouldn't produce any documents to verify the story, and no one insisted on the verification. Instead, pro-Assad activists, the Russian state, the foreign ministry, the defense ministry, and some activists just repeated what Alex said and put it out through outlets like Counterpunch, until we get to, well, where we are now. Because last week, on November the 24th at midnight, WikiLeaks finally produced an email from Alex. WikiLeaks put it up on a page. It may have been the same email the journalist had seen at the presentation. Don't know, but it might have been. What matters is that the email, which is dated June the 28th, just 2018, just before the interim report came out, is Alex's complaint. It's Alex's complaint to others at the OPCW that he was really not allowed to carry the story, that there was no possibility that chlorine had been used. Absolutely no possibility. Because the other members of the fact-finding mission in the interim report had said, no, there is still a possibility it's used, or at least it has to be investigated further, Alex complained, went to higher-ups and said, you must let me put my side of the story alongside the interim report. And the OPCW, which doesn't work that way, which establishes, if not a consensus, a majority of the fact-finding mission and the analysts and the experts, put out the interim report while noting what Alex had said in the drafting. And indeed, later on, when Alex was outside the fact-finding mission, the OPCW took what its experts, its analysts said, while still noting his views, as we know, because there were modifications in the final report. But Alex's email now was the story, because he said that there were 3 Americans who showed up in the office of one of the senior officials of the OPCW, implying that they insisted that the report should be changed. This was all now a conspiracy, a government conspiracy to prevent the truth, Alex's truth, from coming out. Now, if WikiLeaks had been the only source of this, well, okay, a few activists would have picked it up and not much would have occurred. But now, finally, the story made it to a wide, basically an outlet with mass circulation, a tabloid called the Mail on Sunday in the United Kingdom. Now, the Mail on Sunday is better known basically for celebrity gossip and for very sensationalist stories. But it has a writer named Peter Hitchens. Now, Peter Hitchens, for years, and he's not a Syria expert. He knows very little about Syria. He knows very little about the OPCW, but Peter Hitchens is convinced that everything that is being told to us in Syria is a setup for Western military intervention, that the West will go into war in Syria in the same way that it went to war in Iraq in 2003. Now, I can understand certainly anyone's concern about that. But the point here is that, well, for more than 2 years, Peter Hitchens has trashed the OPCW, has said it's effectively being manipulated, it's being undermined. And he said this is all because it's setting up a pretext for Western bombing. Because it is important to note that a week after the Douma chemical attack, the chlorine attack, that in one of its rare examples of intervening against the Assad regime, the United States, as well as Britain and France, attacked 3 facilities that are linked to Syria's chemical weapons program. And Hitchens was basically saying, look, you know, this was all basically manipulated to justify what had occurred. Hitchens is a chemical attacks denier. He denies, he's never acknowledged any chemical attack. He specifically became involved in the 2017 discussion of the sarin attack in northwest Syria, the one where the OPCW, through the Joint Investigative Mechanism, said yes, it was the Assad regime that used sarin that killed and wounded hundreds of people. And to this day, Hitchens insists that that report was manipulated, that there's no way it could have happened that way, even though he has no chemical expertise. He has no expertise regarding in terms of aircraft and the way they operate. He actually doesn't even understand the OPCW's internal processes and the way they construct reports. So sure enough, 45 minutes before WikiLeaks published the email, the Mail on Sunday splashed a story written by Peter Hitchens, which said that it was a sexed up dossier, that phrase from Iraq in 2003, that had justified the US-led attacks. Sexed up dossier. In other words, something that was void of fact, that was void of findings. It was manipulated. If you read the story, it's very interesting. There's no other piece of evidence apart from the email from Alex. Nothing. Indeed, in a separate sidebar on his blog, Peter Hitchens published the email again, but added absolutely nothing. Well, let's put it this way. Let's go back to those original questions. Did Peter Hitchens verify who Alex is? When I asked Mr. Hitchens this question, he said, oh, I never said it was Alex. I don't, who is it? How do you know it's Alex? How do you know it's the same guy that was at the Courage Foundation a month earlier? Well, you know that because you can match up what I said at the Courage Foundation with the email. Plus, we have supporting sources for it. But, well, apparently Mr. Hitchens didn't think it was worthwhile to verify who the author of the document was, which is quite curious indeed. I said, well, how did you verify? How did you verify and corroborate the claims? And Hitchens never responded by establishing that he had verified anything. Instead, he finally said, it's not up to me to show you evidence. Not up to me to tell you what I did. I'm a journalist. Well, yes, he's a journalist who did no verification, no corroboration of what had taken place. He just simply, he copied and pasted the document and let it stand. Needless to say, I didn't even ask Peter Hitchens if Alex had shown him any documents or had shown him anything to support the email, because of course Peter Hitchens says he doesn't even know who Alex is. In other words, Peter Hitchens was a conduit. He was a conduit for the document that was put out by WikiLeaks, the document that was written by Alex in June of 2018. But he was a very useful conduit because the Russian state, the Assad regime, and pro-Assad activists could now cite a large British newspaper, the Mail on Sunday, covering the story. One final stage of this before we establish what happened and cut through the disinformation and why it's so important. So, a couple nights ago, a guy named Tucker Carlson, US viewers will probably know who Tucker Carlson is. He's a polemicist. He's an attack commentator on Fox TV. He is sympathetic to the hard right. He has been accused of being racist. He is prone to putting out conspiracy theories that are not established. Tucker Carlson went into a long ramble about how this had been exposed, that there was no chlorine attack. It was all a setup to blame the Assad regime, to justify American intervention. A curious case of where the hard right meets with the anti-imperialist left. Tucker Carlson then brought on Jonathan Steele of The Guardian, and Jonathan Steele of The Guardian repeated the story he published in Counterpunch, which was just simply repeating Alex's email and summarizing it with no additional evidence. And Tucker told his viewers, look, it was all a hoax. No one died from chlorine in Douma. No one. Those 43 didn't die from it. Why does this matter, folks? Well, it matters immediately because this week, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons are having what they call their Conference of State Parties. That's their member states who are gathering in The Hague to discuss issues of concern to the organization and to get updates. In advance of that meeting, the Russians again put out the idea that the OPCW has been politicized, that you can't trust its findings. And they again questioned the investigations and identification team. In other words, tried to shut down its work. The Director General, Fernando Arias, in his opening statement, pushed back and said he stands by the OPCW's reports on Douma. He stands by his inspectors who are professional. That reports in the media, that you have them that circulate, that, may dispute what they've done, but the reports are corroborated, established, analyzed, and he's not backing away. That will probably not be enough for the Russians. They will continue their propaganda. They will find certain writers. Perhaps Mr. Hitchens will continue to support them. And they will keep pushing at the investigations and the identification team and indeed against the OPCW itself. Not to get rid of the organizations, but to neuter it. So what you're talking about here, beyond Douma, is a story about trying to prevent any type of accountability for chemical weapons attacks. But it's also one other thing, because you'll notice that in all those accounts, whether it's the Henderson memorandum, Alex's email, the reports that were written about it by Jonathan Steele or by Peter Hitchens, and of course, the account in WikiLeaks, no one mentions the victims. No one mentions those 43 people that died. No one mentions the thousands that died in East Ghouta, that region near Damascus, in that 2 months of attacks by Russia and the Assad regime. Nobody mentions the far more than 100,000 civilians that have been killed since 2011, more than 90% of them by the Assad regime and the Russians. Nobody mentions them. Indeed, the working group on Syria, propaganda in the media, those UK academics who prop up the Assad regime narrative, they manipulate the victims to say they were all part of a staged massacre, a plot by the opposition. If you were to remember victims, if you were to honor them, if there's anything to come out of this absolutely unnecessary conflict in which hundreds of thousands of people have been killed because of repression, because of the resort to violence by regimes and by leaders, if you were going to get anything out of this, you have to remember the victims by remembering what happened to them. If you try to deny chemical attacks, if you deny the crimes, if you deny the cause of those deaths, you justify those deaths. You cause pain to those who are still alive, who have suffered. You cause pain to those who are trying to remember, but in your justification, you ensure that it will happen again. That beyond Douma in April 2018, maybe in another country, maybe beyond the Middle East, when someone else attacks their population with chemical weapons or just intensively conventional weapons, that you will excuse it once more. You will all say it's a part of a plot by other countries. It's part of a plot by organizations. These victims really didn't die the way you think they did. Move along, folks. Nothing to say. Not the type of world I want to live in. This has been a long one. I appreciate those of you who are interested in Syria, or those of you who are just learning about Syria or interested in broader issues, coming and chatting with me. Do follow up by dropping me a line here on Facebook, by hitting me up on Twitter at ScottLucas_EA. Most of all, folks, remember those who are the victims, and y'all be decent to each other. Thank you so much for listening today.